Judge mocks black man in court, then freezes at his legal brilliance. The courtroom buzzed with soft murmurs as Marcus Bell stood alone at the defendant's table. He straightened his slightly worn suit jacket and adjusted his tie, the fabric thin from years of use. His palms rested flat on the table, steady despite the current of adrenaline rushing through his veins. Across from him, Judge William Hargrove lounged in his seat, tapping a gavel lazily against his bench. The smirk on the older white man's face was unmistakable. "Representing yourself, Mr. Bell?" Hargrove's voice rang out across the courtroom, dripping with amusement. "Well, this should be entertaining." Chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Some came from the attorneys seated on the sidelines, others from the public benches where a few bored onlookers leaned in for a better view. Marcus heard every condescending snicker but didn't flinch. His dark brown eyes locked onto the judge's with a steadiness that made the room still for half a second. "I'm not here to entertain you, Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here to win." For a fraction of a second, Hargrove's smirk twitched, almost disappearing. The judge straightened slightly, tapping the gavel once more with an audible crack. "We'll see about that," he muttered, turning his attention to the documents in front of him. "Proceed." Marcus inhaled slowly, forcing his mind to stay clear. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for his mother's legacy, for every person who had ever been steamrolled by a system rigged against them. 6 months earlier, the world had felt very different. The morning sun had poured over the cracked steps of Edith Bell's modest home, the air thick with the scents of magnolia and fresh-cut grass. It was the house his mother had fought tooth and nail to pay off, working double shifts as a nurse's aide for over 3 decades. Marcus remembered that morning vividly because it was the day he found the eviction notice. The notice was stapled to the front door in garish red ink. Final notice. Property to be vacated in 14 days. He stared at it for what felt like an eternity, his heart hammering against his ribs. It wasn't possible. His mother had celebrated burning the mortgage papers just 2 years before she passed. How could there be an outstanding loan? How could he be facing eviction from the house she had bled to keep? Clutching the paper in his fist, Marcus had stormed inside, his mind reeling. He yanked open the old oak filing cabinet tucked away in the living room corner, pulling out every yellow document and receipt his mother had so meticulously kept. There it all was. The deed, the payoff statement, the bank letters confirming her ownership free and clear. Except for one. Buried in the middle was a document Marcus had never seen before. A second mortgage agreement, dated 2 years prior to her death, bearing what looked like her signature. But Marcus knew better. The signature was shaky, the slant wrong. His mother's handwriting had been steady even in her final years. The air felt too thick to breathe. Betrayal pulsed at his temples. The first call was to the bank. After being transferred 3 times and placed on hold for over 45 minutes, he finally reached someone in the foreclosure department, a clipped, disinterested woman who treated his questions like an inconvenience. "There's nothing we can do," she said coolly. "The account is in default. Foreclosure proceedings are final." "But my mother never took out a second mortgage," Marcus insisted, voice tight. "I have proof the original mortgage was paid off. I have the deed." "The signed agreement is on file, sir," she said with a sigh. "Perhaps you were unaware of your mother's financial affairs." The insinuation stung. Marcus gritted his teeth so hard he thought they might crack. "I want copies of every document related to this supposed second loan," he demanded. "You'll need to file a request with our legal department," she said, "but it won't stop the foreclosure." The line went dead. Marcus lowered the phone, staring blankly at the framed photo of his mother smiling in the kitchen, one hand waving a burnt mortgage paper in the air, the other holding a glass of champagne she couldn't really afford. Someone was lying. He drove straight to Crestwood First Financial the next morning, the eviction notice folded tightly in his pocket. The branch manager, Darren Vance, greeted him with the smug, disingenuous smile of a man who had spent too long in a position of unchecked power. Marcus spread out the documents across Vance's polished desk, pointing to the discrepancies. "Look at the signatures," Marcus urged. "You know this isn't real. You know my mother didn't take out a second loan." Vance barely glanced at the papers before sliding them back across the desk with 2 fingers. "Signatures change," he said with a casual shrug. "People get desperate. Maybe she needed money for medical bills. Maybe she didn't tell you." Marcus leaned forward, lowering his voice to a deadly calm. "She didn't need to tell me. I know my mother. She didn't sign that." Vance smiled wider, a flash of teeth that never touched his eyes. "If you want to fight it, Mr. Bell, hire a lawyer, but you've got less than 2 weeks." "Tick-tock." Marcus rose slowly, gathering the papers without another word. In that moment, he understood. This wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate, and they believed he would fold because people like him always did. Driving home, Marcus replayed the conversation over and over. Every slight, every patronizing smirk, every word dripping with condescension. It wasn't just about his house, it was about power. About erasing people like his mother, and him, without so much as a second thought. That night, he sat at the kitchen table, the deeds spread out before him under the harsh glow of the ceiling light. His laptop hummed softly, screen open to pages of legal jargon he barely understood but was determined to learn. Mortgage fraud, forged documents, foreclosure defenses. Somewhere deep inside, something hardened. They expected him to lose. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. His phone buzzed. A text from Nia, his girlfriend. "How bad is it?" He stared at the screen for a long time before typing back, "Bad. But I'm not giving up." It was past midnight when Marcus closed the laptop. His eyes burned, and his head ached, but he had the beginnings of a plan. He couldn't afford a lawyer. He couldn't afford anything, really, but he had the truth. And if that wasn't enough, then he would make it enough. As he flipped off the kitchen light and made his way to bed, Marcus knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't just a fight for a house. This was a fight for his mother's honor, for his dignity, for justice itself, and he was just getting started. The next morning, Marcus Bell stood in the cramped hallway of the Crestwood County Courthouse, a battered folder tucked under his arm. His suit was still the same one from yesterday, slightly wrinkled and hanging looser on his frame than it used to. Every few minutes he glanced down at the clock over the clerk's office window. Time was slipping through his fingers, and he knew it. When his turn finally came, the clerk, a woman in her 50s with pinched lips and tired eyes, barely looked up. "Name?" she asked flatly. "Marcus Bell," he said, setting the folder on the counter. "I'm here to file a motion for a stay of eviction." She sighed as if she had heard the same desperate plea 1,000 times that morning alone. Her fingers tapped across her keyboard with mechanical indifference. "Representing yourself?" she asked, her tone almost pitying. "Yes." She slid a packet of forms toward him. "Fill these out. The judge will review them. Might get a hearing, might not." Marcus picked up the forms, ignoring the growing knot in his gut. He carried them over to a battered metal bench against the wall and started writing. His hand shook slightly as he filled in each line, careful, deliberate. Every word mattered. Across the hallway, sleek men and women in expensive suits laughed over coffee cups and briefcases. No one looked at him. No one ever looked at people like him until it was time to take something from them. By noon, he handed the paperwork back. The clerk barely glanced at it. "You'll be notified if a hearing's scheduled," she said, already turning to the next person. Marcus left the courthouse with the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. Outside, the sun was cruel, beating down on the concrete and the endless sea of cars. He sat on the edge of a crumbling planter, staring at the traffic. His phone buzzed. It was Nia. "Any luck?" she asked, her voice thin over the line. "I filed it," he said. "That's all I could do." There was a long silence. "I'm proud of you," she said finally. "No matter what happens." But Marcus didn't feel proud. He felt like he was drowning. That night he sat at the kitchen table again, the same table where his mother had once helped him with school projects and birthday cakes. He spread out the bank documents, the eviction notice, the deed, and the mysterious second mortgage. None of it made sense. The more he read, the more obvious it became that something was wrong. The notary stamp on the second mortgage agreement was smudged. The loan officer's signature was barely legible. The dates were suspiciously close together, as if someone had rushed through the paperwork. Frustration boiled in his chest. He wanted to scream, to punch a wall, to do anything but sit here feeling helpless. Instead, he opened his laptop and typed "mortgage fraud, how to fight foreclosure" into the search bar. The results were overwhelming. Case after case of families losing their homes to banks that had cut corners, fabricated documents, and weaponized the courts against people who didn't have the money or the knowledge to fight back. But one name kept coming up: civil rights attorney Julian Moore. A bulldog of a lawyer known for dragging dirty banks through the mud and winning. Marcus jotted down the number, heart racing. The next morning, he stood outside Moore's office, an unassuming brick building squeezed between a bail bond shop and a closed diner. The receptionist, a young black woman with tight curls and a sharp gaze, gave him a look as he stepped inside. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. "No," Marcus admitted. "But I really need to speak to Mr. Moore." She studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Wait here." Minutes later, Julian Moore appeared. He was shorter than Marcus expected, with a thick salt and pepper beard and sharp, assessing eyes. "Walk with me," Moore said, jerking his head toward the door. They walked side by side down the sidewalk, Marcus struggling to explain everything in a rush of words. The forged document, the bank stonewalling, the eviction notice. Moore listened without interrupting. When Marcus finally finished, Moore scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Sounds like they're banking on you being too broke or scared to fight," he said. "I can't afford a lawyer," Marcus said quietly. "I just need advice. Anything." Moore stopped walking, turning to face him. "You want my advice?" he asked. Marcus nodded. "Learn their playbook better than they know it themselves," Moore said. "The law is complicated by design. It's meant to keep people like us out, but it's still there. You just gotta know where to hit." "How?" Marcus asked, feeling the weight of the impossible task ahead. Moore gave a thin smile. "Start with the chain of title. If they can't prove a clean chain from the original mortgage to the current one, they can't foreclose." Marcus blinked. "Chain of title?" "Every time a loan changes hands, there has to be proper documentation," Moore explained. "Endorsements, assignments, transfers. If even one step is missing or screwed up, the foreclosure falls apart." Hope flickered in Marcus's chest for the first time in days. "Thank you," he said, voice thick. Moore clapped him on the shoulder. "Don't thank me yet." "You're walking into a gunfight with a stick, but sometimes if you swing hard enough, a stick's all you need." That night, Marcus buried himself in research. He pulled every public record he could find. Hours turned into days, and there it was, the smoking gun. The bank's supposed transfer of his mother's mortgage had skipped a step. There was no recorded endorsement from the previous holder. The loan had been sold, bundled into a mortgage-backed security, and somehow reappeared in Crestwood First Financial's hands without the legal trail to prove it. No chain of title, no right to foreclose. Marcus sat back in his chair, heart pounding so loud he could barely hear the creak of the floorboards under his shifting weight. He had them. But would the court even listen? Across town, in a sleek boardroom lit by harsh fluorescent lights, Darren Vance leaned back in his chair and smiled as he signed another eviction order. Marcus Bell was a minor obstacle, one that would be swept away like all the others. Or so he thought. Because Marcus wasn't just another name on a piece of paper, he was a storm coming, and the system wasn't ready for him. Marcus sat in the dim light of the community library, papers spread across the table like the battlefield it was. His eyes burned from reading legal documents for hours, but the more he read, the sharper his focus became. He wasn't just trying to save his mother's house anymore. He was preparing for war. His phone buzzed against the table, and he glanced down. It was a message from Nia. "You okay?" It read. He smiled faintly and texted back, "Fighting smarter now." The smile faded as quickly as it came. He gathered his notes, shoved them into the battered folder, and headed for the courthouse. If he was going to stop the eviction, he needed the judge to see what he had found. The missing endorsement was more than a mistake. It was the crack in the dam, and he intended to widen it until the whole system flooded. Inside the courthouse, the air was stale with the smell of old carpet and stronger with quiet judgment. Marcus stepped into the clerk's office and handed over a motion he'd written himself, citing the missing chain of title and asking for an emergency hearing. The clerk, a younger woman this time, scanned the paperwork, raising an eyebrow. "You wrote this yourself?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. She hesitated, then stamped it without further comment. "Good luck," she muttered. Marcus didn't need luck. He needed the truth to matter for once. 2 days later, the hearing was scheduled. As Marcus walked into courtroom 2B, he saw Judge Ronald Whitaker on the bench, a heavy-set white man in his late 60s who wore his disdain like a second robe. Judge Whitaker had a reputation, quick to dismiss pro se litigants, even quicker to belittle them. Across the aisle, Darren Vance sat at the plaintiff's table, his gray suit perfectly pressed, his gold watch catching the morning light as he flipped casually through his notes. He barely spared Marcus a glance. The bailiff called the room to order, and Marcus rose to his feet. "Mr. Bell," Judge Whitaker said, adjusting his glasses. "Representing yourself, I see. This should be entertaining." There were snickers from a few of the attorneys sitting in the gallery. Marcus felt his face flush but held his ground. "I'm here to defend my family's home, Your Honor," he said, voice steady. Judge Whitaker sighed as if Marcus had already wasted his morning. "Proceed," the judge said, waving his hand. Marcus stepped forward and laid out his case. He pointed to the lack of a proper endorsement, the broken chain of title, and the legal requirement that a lender prove ownership before foreclosing. "Without a valid chain of title," Marcus said, "the plaintiff has no standing to enforce this foreclosure." Whitaker leaned back, rubbing his chin with a smirk. "Mr. Bell, are you a lawyer?" he asked, a hint of mockery in his tone. "No, Your Honor," Marcus replied. "Then perhaps you should leave the lawyering to professionals," Whitaker said, chuckling. Marcus didn't flinch. He opened the folder and pulled out copies of the case law he'd spent nights researching. Precedents from state and federal courts upholding challenges to improper mortgage transfers. "I may not be a lawyer," Marcus said evenly, "but I can read, and I can follow the law just like anyone else." He handed the cases up to the clerk, who passed them to Whitaker. The judge skimmed them, his smirk fading slightly. Vance stood then, his tone dripping with false concern. Your Honor, Mr. Bell's claims are a desperate attempt to delay a lawful foreclosure. Procedural mistakes happen, but they don't invalidate the underlying debt. Marcus turned toward him. I'm not disputing the debt, Marcus said sharply. I'm disputing your right to enforce it without proper ownership. The courtroom grew quieter. Even Whitaker seemed to sit up a little straighter. You're alleging fraud, Whitaker asked. I'm alleging that without a clean chain of title, Marcus said, this foreclosure is illegal. Whether it's fraud or negligence is for this court to determine. Whitaker stared at him for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the bench. The smirk was gone now. The judge looked annoyed, but also wary. He could no longer dismiss Marcus out of hand. Mr. Vance, Whitaker said finally, turning to the bank's attorney, can you produce the original note and all endorsements? Vance hesitated, the first crack appearing in his polished armor. Not at this moment, Your Honor, he said carefully, but we can provide certified copies. Whitaker's eyes narrowed. Certified copies are not the same as originals, Counselor, he said sharply. Especially in a contested foreclosure. Vance opened his mouth to argue, but thought better of it. Whitaker turned back to Marcus. I'm granting a temporary stay, the judge said grudgingly. The plaintiff has 7 days to produce the original documents and prove the chain of title is unbroken. If they fail, this foreclosure is dismissed. Marcus almost sagged with relief, but kept his face composed. He nodded respectfully. Thank you, Your Honor. Whitaker banged the gavel and stood, robes billowing as he left the bench. The gallery buzzed with whispers. As Marcus gathered his papers, Vance approached, his smile tight and cold. You made a mistake, Bell, Vance said under his breath. You think you've won something. All you've done is made yourself a target. Marcus met his eyes, steady and unafraid. Good, he said. Now I know where to aim. Outside the courthouse, Nia was waiting on the steps. She ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck. You did it, she whispered. Not yet, Marcus said. But I gave them something to be scared of. He looked back at the courthouse doors, knowing the war was just beginning. The bank wouldn't back down. They'd fight dirtier. They'd try to bury him. But for the first time, Marcus wasn't afraid. He had the truth on his side, and he was just getting started. The sun beat down hard on Marcus as he stood on the cracked sidewalk outside the courthouse, a folder clutched in his hand. For a brief moment he'd tasted victory, but the bitter weight of reality settled back on his shoulders fast. Winning a temporary stay wasn't the end. It was the start of a much dirtier fight. 3 days after the hearing, Marcus received a thick envelope shoved under his motel room door. Inside was a notice from the bank's legal team, a motion to dismiss, loaded with complicated legal language and vague accusations against Marcus himself. They were accusing him of filing frivolous claims to obstruct the foreclosure. It was a tactic he had read about in late-night legal blogs, bury the opposition in motions until they suffocated under the weight of procedure. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the papers. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from fury. He could almost hear Darren Vance's smug voice whispering, "You should have known better than to fight us." The next morning, Marcus stormed into Boyd Whitmore Legal Aid. It was a run-down office, squeezed between a pawn shop and a bail bondsman. Inside, Terrence Boyd looked up from his cluttered desk and immediately stood, sensing the storm Marcus carried in with him. "They're hitting back," Marcus said, dropping the motion to dismiss onto the desk. Boyd thumbed through the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with every line he read. "Typical," Boyd muttered. "Delay, discredit, destroy." Marcus paced the room, the worn carpet threadbare under his boots. "They're calling me a liar, a fraud," Marcus said, voice tight. "I've done everything right, and they're still trying to erase me." Boyd leaned back in his chair, studying him. "You're scaring them," Boyd said simply. "If they weren't afraid, they wouldn't be trying so hard to silence you." Marcus stopped pacing, breathing heavily. "So what do we do?" he asked. Boyd tapped a pen against the desk. "We fight smarter. They want to drown you in paperwork? Fine. We counter. File our own motion demanding full discovery." "Discovery," Marcus echoed. Boyd nodded. "We force them to produce everything. Original mortgage documents, chain of title records, internal emails, and if there's anything shady, and there usually is, we'll find it." Marcus's blood stirred at the thought. He wasn't just defending himself now, he was going on offense. Over the next 2 days, Marcus practically lived at the legal aid office. Boyd and his small team helped him draft a motion for discovery, laced with references to banking regulations and foreclosure fraud statutes. Marcus insisted on reading every line himself, refusing to sign anything he didn't fully understand. On the morning they filed the motion, Marcus walked into the courthouse with his head high, despite the heavy stares he felt drilling into his back. Darren Vance was waiting inside, along with a new face, a thin woman with sharp features and a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. "Who's that?" Marcus whispered to Boyd as they approached the plaintiff's table. "That," Boyd said grimly, "is Caroline Steele. She's the bank's hatchet attorney. They only bring her in when things get ugly." Ugly didn't scare Marcus anymore. When the hearing began, Judge Whitaker barely concealed his annoyance. "Mr. Bell, I see you filed yet another motion," Whitaker said, thumbing through the papers. Marcus stood tall. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm requesting discovery of the original documents the plaintiff claims to have." Caroline Steele rose to her feet, a tight smile on her face. "Your Honor, the defendant's motion is nothing but a fishing expedition. He has no evidence of wrongdoing. This is a waste of the court's time." Marcus stepped forward before the judge could speak. "Your Honor," he said, voice firm, "if the plaintiff has nothing to hide, they should have no problem producing the documents." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Whitaker's jaw worked for a moment as if grinding his teeth. Finally, he sighed heavily. "I'm granting limited discovery," Whitaker said. "Plaintiff must produce the original mortgage, chain of title, and any assignments within 7 days." Caroline Steele's smile vanished. Marcus sat down, heart thudding in his chest. It was a small win, but a vital one. He had cracked open the door. Now he just had to shove it wide. Outside the courthouse, as Marcus and Boyd walked toward the parking lot, Boyd clapped him on the back. "You rattled them," Boyd said with a grin. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. "Good," he said. "Because I'm just getting started." Later that night, as he sat in the dim light of the motel room, Marcus's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number flashed on the screen. "Stop digging. You won't like what you find." Marcus stared at the message, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. They were watching him. They were scared. And that meant he was getting close. He deleted the message, turned off the light, and lay awake in the darkness, planning his next move. Because no matter how dirty they played, he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. Marcus stood under the sickly yellow lights of the courthouse lobby, feeling the weight of the folder pressed tight against his chest. Today was the deadline. Today the bank was supposed to produce the documents Judge Whitaker had ordered. Boyd was pacing nearby, muttering to himself, running through the procedural possibilities. Marcus tried to focus, but his mind buzzed with a low static of nerves. Every instinct told him they were about to pull something shady, and he wasn't wrong. At 9 a.m. sharp, the courtroom doors opened. Caroline Steele swept in, sharp as a scalpel, carrying 2 thin manila folders. She flashed a confident smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. Judge Whitaker took the bench, adjusted his glasses, and called the session to order. "Ms. Steele," Whitaker said, tapping the gavel once. "You were ordered to produce the original documents." Steele rose smoothly. "Yes, Your Honor. We have complied." "Here is the original mortgage and assignment of rights." She handed the folders to the bailiff, who delivered them to the judge. Whitaker flipped through the papers, frowning slightly. Marcus watched every twitch of the judge's eyebrows, every crease forming between his brows. Boyd leaned in and whispered, "He sees it. Something's wrong." Whitaker set the papers down with a loud thud. "These documents are concerning," he said carefully. "There appears to be a missing endorsement on the final transfer." Steele's smile didn't falter. "Clerical error, Your Honor. Happens all the time." Marcus stood. "With respect, Your Honor, this is not a clerical error. Without a valid chain of title, they had no legal standing to foreclose. They never owned the loan." Whitaker stared at Marcus, the corners of his mouth pulling downward. He didn't like being put in this position. Marcus could feel it, but facts were facts. "Ms. Steele," Whitaker said, voice sharpening, "you have 7 days to produce the missing endorsements. Failure to do so will result in serious sanctions." Steele nodded, but Marcus caught the flicker of unease that crossed her face before she sat down. As the gavel came down, signaling the end of the session, Marcus and Boyd gathered their papers. They made it out of the courthouse without incident. Almost. At the base of the courthouse steps, Darren Vance was waiting. He stood next to a black SUV, arms folded, a sneer twisting his mouth. "Enjoy your little victory," Vance said as Marcus approached. "It's not going to last." Marcus stared him down, every muscle in his body coiled tight. "You scared?" Marcus asked, voice low. Vance laughed, the sound bitter. "Scared? Of you?" He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "You're a broke amateur. You think you're gonna beat a machine that's been grinding people like you into dust for decades?" Marcus didn't blink. "I don't have to beat the machine," he said quietly. "I just have to break one gear." Vance's smile faltered for just a second. Then he shoved past Marcus, climbed into the SUV, and peeled away from the curb. Boyd clapped Marcus on the back. "Gears already cracking," he said. That night, back at the motel, Marcus couldn't sleep. He kept turning the day over and over in his mind, looking for the loose thread he could yank. He was halfway through reviewing the scanned documents on his laptop when he saw it. A detail so small, he almost missed it. The notary's stamp on the assignment of rights was dated 3 months after the foreclosure had already begun. It meant they had retroactively tried to patch their mistake after the fact. And it was illegal. Marcus's heart pounded. He grabbed his phone and texted Boyd. "Found it." "Meet tomorrow morning, game changer," Boyd replied immediately. "Copy everything. Print backups. This is our kill shot." The next morning, Marcus showed Boyd the discrepancy. Boyd whistled low. "This isn't just procedural sloppiness. This is fraud. This could bring down the whole case, maybe even land a few people in handcuffs if we're lucky." Marcus grinned for the first time in what felt like weeks. "Good," he said. "They wanted a fight. Now they've got one." But just as they were packing up the documents to file a supplemental motion, Marcus's phone buzzed again. It was a private number. Against his better judgment, he answered. A familiar, smooth voice slid into his ear. "You really should have taken the offer, Mr. Bell." Marcus froze. "You think freezing my accounts and throwing me out of my home scared me?" he said, voice rising. The voice chuckled. "This is bigger than your little vendetta. Walk away." "Final warning." The line went dead. Marcus lowered the phone slowly, rage burning in his chest. "They're desperate," Boyd said quietly. Marcus nodded. "And desperate men make mistakes." They finished compiling the evidence, triple-checked everything, and filed the supplemental motion before noon. It cited the fraudulent notary stamp, attached visual evidence, and demanded immediate sanctions against the bank and their attorneys. Marcus sat outside the courthouse afterward, sipping bad coffee, his heart still hammering. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he knew without a doubt, the machine was breaking. And he was the one breaking it. Marcus Bell sat at the rickety motel desk, the single bulb above him casting long shadows across the stacks of papers and files he had gathered. His heart raced as he refreshed the court docket page again and again. Finally, it appeared, a hearing had been set. Emergency motion to review alleged fraud submitted by the defendant, Marcus Bell. He leaned back, exhaling shakily. This was it. He had fired his shot. Now they would either scramble or fall apart completely. But he wasn't naive. He knew they wouldn't just roll over. They would come for him harder than ever. His phone buzzed. A text from Boyd. "Be ready. They're not going to fight fair." The next morning, Marcus arrived at the courthouse early. Boyd met him at the front steps, briefcase in hand, face grim. "They filed a counter motion late last night," Boyd said, "claiming your evidence is fabricated." "They're accusing you of tampering." Marcus blinked. "They're trying to flip it on me?" Boyd nodded. "And they're calling in their big guns. They hired a white shoe law firm downtown to bury you." Marcus tightened his grip on the strap of his worn leather bag. "Let them try." The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back walls, scribbling notes. Whispers floated over the crowd like mist. At the plaintiff's table, Caroline Steele sat stone-faced beside two new attorneys, polished, ruthless types in immaculate suits. Darren Vance was conspicuously absent, which told Marcus everything he needed to know. They were throwing him under the bus to protect the bigger machine. Judge Whitaker entered, his expression harder than usual. He called the court to order with two sharp bangs of the gavel. "Mr. Bell, Mr. Boyd," he began, adjusting his glasses. "I understand you have new evidence to present?" Boyd stood. "Yes, Your Honor. We have uncovered clear evidence of fraud. A notary stamp post-dating the foreclosure proceedings, which suggests the bank attempted to backfill missing documentation after seizing the property." Steele rose immediately. "Your Honor, the defense's so-called evidence is speculative at best. Furthermore, we believe Mr. Bell may have tampered with documents in an effort to derail lawful proceedings." Marcus shot to his feet, fury rising. "I didn't fabricate anything. I found their lies because they left the trail themselves." Whitaker held up a hand. "Enough. I will review the evidence myself." The bailiff took the flash drive from Boyd and loaded it into the courtroom computer. Grainy footage from the bank's conference room appeared on the screen, audio playing through tinny speakers. "If we delay processing just enough, by the time they realize the signatures don't match, it won't matter." The courtroom froze. Whitaker leaned forward, his eyes sharpening. Caroline Steele's face remained impassive, but one of the hired guns shifted uncomfortably. The judge rewound the clip and played it again. "If we delay processing just enough, by the time they realize the signatures don't match, it won't matter." When the video ended, the room erupted into hushed murmuring. Steele stood, smoothing her skirt. "Your Honor, that recording was obtained illegally. Chain of custody is compromised. We move to exclude it from evidence." Boyd responded immediately. The whistleblower who provided this footage submitted a sworn affidavit verifying its authenticity. The bank's own records corroborate it. Whitaker frowned deeply, tapping his pen against the bench. You expect me to ignore blatant admissions of fraud because you don't like how it came to light? Steele hesitated. Your Honor, the integrity of the judicial process. The judicial process, Whitaker snapped, has already been violated by whoever thought it was acceptable to forge documents to steal homes. Marcus's pulse roared in his ears. He felt the tide turning, the whole weight of the system finally hesitating under the sheer gravity of truth. Whitaker turned to him. Mr. Bell, you are prepared to testify under oath as to how you obtained this evidence? Yes, Your Honor. And your whistleblower is willing to appear if necessary? Boyd nodded. Already scheduled to testify if the court deems it needed. Whitaker exhaled, rubbing his temple. This court finds there is substantial evidence of fraudulent conduct sufficient to warrant a full evidentiary hearing. The foreclosure proceedings are hereby stayed indefinitely. The gavel cracked against the bench. Marcus sagged slightly with relief, but he knew it wasn't over. As the courtroom emptied, Steele packed her papers with tight, precise movements. One of the new attorneys leaned over and whispered something to her, and she stiffened. Then, in a move Marcus didn't expect, she approached him directly. You should have taken the settlement, Mr. Bell, she said coldly, voice low enough only he and Boyd could hear. You don't know the forces you're playing with. Marcus met her gaze, steady and unflinching. And you don't know the people you're underestimating. She gave a tight, humorless smile and turned away. Boyd nudged Marcus. They're scared, he said. Marcus nodded slowly. Good. Later that night, as he sat on the stoop of the old motel, Marcus received another text. A picture. His motel room door kicked in, his few belongings scattered across the floor. No message. No number. Just a warning. Marcus stared at it for a long moment before locking the phone and slipping it back into his pocket. They could come after his things. They could come after his money. But they couldn't unmake the truth. And Marcus Bell wasn't going anywhere. He looked up at the dark sky, a faint grin curling at the corner of his mouth. The real fight was just beginning. The courthouse buzzed with tension as Marcus Bell entered, the morning air sharp against his skin. Today wasn't just another hearing. Today was the evidentiary hearing Judge Whitaker had ordered. Today, Marcus was going to lay everything bare. Boyd walked beside him, carrying 2 heavy binders filled with exhibits, affidavits, video transcripts, and notarized statements. Around them, reporters milled about, sensing that something seismic was about to happen. Inside the courtroom, Darren Vance was back, sitting stiffly at the plaintiff's table. Caroline Steele flanked him, her mouth set in a hard line. The polished defense attorneys Marcus had faced before were there too, shuffling papers, avoiding eye contact. Marcus took his seat and immediately felt the weight of every eye in the room settle on him. He adjusted his tie, not out of vanity, but to steady his nerves. Judge Whitaker entered, his robe fluttering slightly as he took his place. He scanned the courtroom, his face unreadable. This hearing will determine whether sufficient evidence exists to sanction the plaintiff and their counsel for fraudulent foreclosure practices, he said firmly. Mr. Bell, Mr. Boyd, you may proceed. Boyd stood and called the first witness, Denise Fowler, the notary who had once unknowingly stamped a forged document. Denise took the stand, her hands trembling slightly as she was sworn in. Marcus watched her closely, silently willing her strength. Ms. Fowler, Boyd began, voice calm, can you tell the court what happened when you notarized the mortgage document at the center of this dispute? Denise cleared her throat. I was approached by a bank representative who told me the client couldn't be present due to illness. They said it was urgent. I notarized the signature without witnessing it. And was that standard practice? Boyd asked gently. No, Denise said, shaking her head. It's against notary law. I was pressured. I realize now I made a terrible mistake. Across the courtroom, Darren Vance shifted uncomfortably. Boyd continued, and when you learned the document was being used to foreclose on Mr. Bell's home, how did you respond? I came forward, Denise said, her voice gaining strength. I had to. Boyd nodded and turned back toward Judge Whitaker. No further questions. The bank's lawyer tried to rattle Denise on cross-examination, suggesting she was coerced into her testimony. But Denise held her ground, her guilt transformed into defiance. Next, Boyd called Linda Ortiz, the former bank employee who had leaked internal emails. Linda's testimony was even more devastating. She described in meticulous detail how the bank had targeted low-income and minority homeowners, rushing foreclosure processes, manipulating paperwork, and instructing employees to delay document processing to outmaneuver challenges. The courtroom fell silent as she described the internal emails, several of which had been entered into evidence. Emails that said things like, minimize litigation exposure, push through high-risk files before the ink dries. Boyd finished his examination, and the bank's attorneys declined to cross-examine Linda. They knew better. Her testimony was ironclad. Finally, it was Marcus's turn. He rose from his seat and made his way to the stand. Sworn in, he sat facing the entire courtroom, and the judge who once mocked him. Boyd's questions were simple but devastating. Mr. Bell, what made you fight back after the foreclosure? Marcus took a breath. This wasn't just about a house, he said, his voice steady. It was about my mother's legacy. About how people like me are seen as disposable. About how they counted on me not knowing the law, not having the resources to fight. He turned slightly, locking eyes with Vance. But they made one mistake. They underestimated me. Boyd smiled faintly. And what did you find when you began investigating? Forgery. Fraud. A system rigged to steamroll anyone who couldn't fight back, Marcus said, and they thought no one would notice because we were too busy surviving. Judge Whitaker leaned forward. Mr. Bell, he said, voice softer than before. Why didn't you settle when they offered? Marcus didn't hesitate. Because some fights are bigger than comfort. Bigger than money. If I walked away, it would keep happening. To someone else. Maybe someone without the chance I had to uncover the truth. The judge nodded slowly and leaned back in his chair, the weight of the moment sinking in. Boyd submitted final exhibits, the timeline of the forged documents, the fake notary stamp dates, the recorded conversations from within the bank. The bank's defense team offered no rebuttal. None. When Boyd rested his case, the courtroom held its breath. Judge Whitaker cleared his throat, his voice filling the hushed room. The evidence presented is deeply troubling, he began, voice heavy. The court finds that First Legacy Bank, through its representatives, engaged in fraudulent practices designed to circumvent legal protections afforded to homeowners. He paused, letting the words sink in. Accordingly, the court orders the foreclosure against Mr. Bell nullified effective immediately. A ripple of stunned whispers spread across the courtroom, but Whitaker wasn't finished. This court is referring this matter to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation and to the state bar for disciplinary review of the bank's counsel. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed in the chamber. Marcus sat frozen for a beat, stunned. He had won, really won. The reporters surged forward, cameras flashing, questions flying. Boyd clapped Marcus on the shoulder, grinning wide. "You broke the machine, kid," he said. Across the courtroom, Darren Vance's face was pale, his mouth slack with disbelief. Caroline Steele stood stiffly, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. As Marcus and Boyd exited the courtroom into the crisp afternoon air, Nia rushed toward him, throwing her arms around his neck. "You did it, Marcus," she whispered, voice thick with tears. "You really did it." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, letting it sink in. But deep down, he knew the battle wasn't over. Not yet. The system had been wounded, but not destroyed. And now that he knew how to fight, he wasn't planning to stop. Not until justice wasn't the exception, until it was the rule. He glanced back at the courthouse one last time, then forward to the horizon, ready for whatever came next. The courtroom buzzed long after Judge Whitaker's gavel came down. Even as the officials packed away evidence boxes and the cameras shut off, the energy stayed thick in the air. Marcus Bell stood silently near the double doors, the reality of what just happened weighing heavily on him. It wasn't just a personal win. It was a crack ripped wide open in a system that had counted on no one ever pushing back this hard. Outside, the courthouse steps were flooded with reporters, microphones bobbing like fishing lures cast toward him. "Mr. Bell, do you have a comment? How does it feel to defeat First Legacy Bank? Do you think this will lead to broader investigations?" Marcus paused at the top of the stairs. For a long moment he said nothing. Then his voice cut through the noise. "This isn't just my fight," he said, loud enough that the microphones caught every word. "This is every person's fight who's ever been told they don't matter, who's ever been steamrolled because someone thought they wouldn't have the strength to push back. Today wasn't about me winning a case. It was about showing them that the game is rigged, and now we all know it." The crowd erupted in questions, but Marcus only raised a hand in quiet goodbye and descended the steps toward Nia and Boyd, waiting by the sidewalk. "You sure you're ready for what's coming next?" Boyd asked, sliding his sunglasses on against the glare. Marcus gave a short laugh. "Ready or not, it's here." Within days, the fallout began. Local news ran features titled, "The Foreclosure Fraud Exposed by One Man's Relentless Fight." National outlets picked up the story. Politicians who once ignored Marcus's calls now scrambled to release statements condemning fraudulent banking practices. Protesters marched outside First Legacy's corporate headquarters. Clients closed their accounts in droves, and the bank retaliated, predictably. Anonymous threats started hitting Marcus's inbox. Letters from debt collectors suddenly arrived at his motel room door, old debts he knew were settled magically reappearing. One night, a brick shattered the window of the small law office where Boyd and the Justice Collective operated. They knew the threats weren't random. They were desperate gasps from a system that realized, for the first time in a long time, it was vulnerable. But Marcus didn't flinch. He used the exposure to build something larger. With Boyd and a handful of others, he founded a non-profit initiative, Project Grounded. Its mission was simple: educate homeowners about their rights, provide legal resources, and train everyday people to understand the tactics banks and courts used against them. They started small: community centers, church basements, libraries, anywhere people would listen. At the first meeting, Marcus stood in front of a room of 20 people, men, women, families clutching foreclosure notices and eviction threats in trembling hands. He smiled. "Let's get to work," he said. Nia stood by the door, managing sign-ins and smiling at him like she was seeing him fully for the first time. "You look different," she told him that night over coffee at the diner, the same place where they'd first sat together after he lost the house. "Yeah," Marcus said, stirring his cup absent-mindedly. I guess fighting back does that to you. A few months later, an independent audit initiated by the State Attorney General's office revealed systematic fraud by First Legacy across 5 states. Executives were indicted. Darren Vance lost his license and faced criminal charges. Caroline Steele quietly resigned, her career ruined. And Judge Whitaker, under mounting public pressure, announced his retirement, leaving behind a bench he had long used to mock and diminish rather than uplift. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that the very courtroom where he had been humiliated became the place where he carved out his victory. One evening, as he stood outside what was once his mother's home, now officially his again, repairs underway, walls getting fresh paint, a woman approached him. She was in her 60s, wearing a worn coat, a foreclosure notice clutched in her hands. "Mr. Bell," she said, her voice cracking. "I saw you on the news. I didn't know who else to turn to." Marcus looked down at the paper in her hand, the same fear and helplessness etched in her eyes that he remembered from his own battle. He smiled warmly. "You're not alone anymore," he said. "Come inside. We'll figure it out." As she followed him up the cracked sidewalk, Marcus knew something deep in his bones. He hadn't just won a case, he had started a movement, one that no amount of intimidation could kill. One built on knowledge, on resilience, on community. The system had underestimated him. They wouldn't make that mistake again. And neither would the world. If you believe in standing up against injustice, even when the odds are stacked against you, even when the system is built to break you, then you are part of this story too. Comment: Justice is worth fighting for below if you believe one voice can make a difference. And if Marcus's journey inspired you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story. Because the fight for justice doesn't end in a courtroom. It lives in every heart that refuses to bow. Stay strong, stay vigilant. And remember, the law isn't just written by those in power. It's rewritten by those who dare to challenge it. Thank you for being part of this journey. See you in the next story.